Hey guys, welcome back to the channel if you're new, welcome back if you aren't, I'm EDJ. We are continuing with Old Britannia's Napoleon videos, and this is the most current and last one, which is Napoleon against Britain, Europe 1809 to 1812. Excuse me. and, yeah, overall, I will say that I've really enjoyed these Old Britannia videos. I find them to be the most informative and thorough Napoleon videos on YouTube by how in-depth he goes to each, mainly the politics of what the heck's going on in Europe at this point. And, I like how he jumps to usually each nation. Like in the past videos, he's jumped and you kind of get the perspective of each nation, what's going on in it, what are they doing, how are they doing. Overall, just beyond informative. And I'm looking forward to seeing more from this, since this is going to be the last one. Until he'll probably make another one in the future, but as of the time of this recording, this is the last, Napoleon video, so let's just get to it. Without any further ado, let's watch Napoleon against Britain, Europe 1809 to 1812.
Continuity of the Bonaparte dynasty. Despite this, the cracks were beginning to show. Russia, France's key ally on the continent, had been notably lethargic in its prosecution of the recent war, and, though happy to take a piece of the Habsburg pie, had made its distaste for further French conquests clear. Prussia had been inches away from throwing off its shackles when the opportunity presented itself, whilst the British amphibious landings in the Netherlands, vast though they were, worried the Emperor more than he let on. This, combined with his first defeat since taking the throne at Aspern, was a warning sign about both the declining quality of French soldiery and Napoleon's own battlefield mastery after years of war. As his biographer Michael Burrows says, the Emperor well knew he had survived the Fifth Coalition by the skin of his teeth. Still, at the end of 1809, none of these problems seemed insurmountable for the greatest empire since the days of Charlemagne.
It's kind of the thing, huh? France was losing so many people through all these constant wars that the quality from like the third and fourth, and even before that, those coalitions was drying up as Napoleon became more reliant on conscripts, right? And it's steadily declining, but Russia, I think, is the moment it just breaks, completely breaks it. But yeah, and it goes to show, like, Napoleon's not invincible. I think that was even a wake-up call for him. Like, he built up this reputation through the fourth coalition as this almost untouchable, great, like, military mastermind. And, like, he got really threatened. I think he actually did get shot or grazed during the fifth coalition. And, he was in precarious situations. Like, Napoleon also sees that not only was his reputation on the line that got hurt from his defeats in Spain and in the Fifth Coalition, but also personally, like, his life, which is probably humbling, because I think Napoleon definitely, maybe to an extent, bought into his own hype. And I imagine that would be a bit more sobering. Obviously not enough to make him deter from what he's doing, but obviously probably a bit of a wake-up call to, yeah, things are kind of shifting. The armies of Europe are adapting to Napoleon. They're learning, and things aren't going to be as smooth as they once were, So yeah.
They became so was largely down to Napoleon himself. The Treaty of Schönbrunn should have brought a respite from major warfare for France. Its European hegemony had been maintained, territorially it had expanded yet further. Even the Emperor himself finally seemed somewhat contented. Plans for a return to the peninsula to win that conflict were repeatedly put off, with Napoleon instead dispatching Massena in the new year to chase down Wellington. That the old marshal was now clearly in steep decline seemed to matter little. Instead of returning to Spain, Napoleon busied himself with domestic problems, and first on the list was the want of an heir. Empress Josephine, old, a spendthrift, and often at odds with the rest of the Bonaparte family, was clearly incapable of bearing him one. But she was also intelligent, vivacious, and could at times provide wise counsel to a lonely figure increasingly surrounded by yes-men. She was also probably the only woman Napoleon ever loved. The dynasty, however, came first. The Emperor had considered making his young nephew Napoleon Charles the heir, but he had tragically died in 1807. Then, during the recent war, a spent bullet had scraped his foot. The wound was superficial, but it told this man of destiny that after everything, he was still a mere mortal. Finally, whilst in Vienna, Marie Walewska, his favourite mistress, had become pregnant. Napoleon knew she had been faithful, giving him conclusive proof that he was capable of producing an heir. By late 1809, he had determined to divorce Josephine. There was little opposition, indeed many of his compatriots had been suggesting such a move for some time. The Empress, though devastated, was lavishly provided for and given their country retreat of Malmaison. Free to marry, Napoleon naturally looked to the royal dynasties of Europe. His immediate wish was to stabilise the shaky alliance with Russia, and so asked for the hand of Anna, the Tsar's sister. The Romanovs were horrified.
Wasn't she like... She was significantly younger than Napoleon. I don't remember how much, but there is an age gap, obviously different time, but still found it creepy. Either way, yeah, I remember reading about this, that basically the Russian court really didn't like Napoleon, and he kind of covered it last video, that many saw him as just an upstart, and, you know, aside from Alexander, you know, there weren't a lot who were, like, pro-Napoleon, and yeah, I think this whole marriage thing doesn't pan out. Basically, I don't remember. I think Tsar Alexander didn't directly just say no, but I think he basically did say no by not letting it happen. And then Napoleon just settled for, you know, the daughter of Emperor Francis of Austria. And I think that kind of helped burn down a bit of the relationship between France and Russia. You know, Napoleon seemingly looking like he was making two offers at once. I think that's how it went. Let's find out. I could be completely wrong about that.
Horrified, Alexander's mother in particular hated the idea. St. Petersburg dithered, making excuse after excuse, and negotiations dragged on. Into this opening stepped the new Austrian foreign minister, Metternich. The Habsburgs had been the revolution's most implacable enemy, and though the wars with Napoleon had taken on a more traditional geopolitical nature, the Emperor Francis, legitimate, loved by his subjects, secure on his throne, was a symbol of everything Napoleon was not. But Metternich was a realist. He saw alliance with France as the best way of preserving Austrian independence. It might, he hoped, even allow for a relaxation of the harsh terms agreed at Schönbrunn. Marie-Louise, the 19-year-old daughter of a reluctant Emperor Francis, was offered as an alternative bride to Napoleon. Bored of waiting for the Romanovs, he accepted. On the 2nd of April 1810, they married in a lavish ceremony. "You are far more handsome than your portrait," were the new Empress's first words to Napoleon. The union was to be a surprisingly happy one. Marie-Louise had grown up despising all things French, and seems to have only agreed to the marriage out of duty, yet she came to have genuine affection for the Emperor. Napoleon likewise seemed to be domestically contented for the first time in his life. After a year of marriage, Marie-Louise bore him the son he so longed for. Immediately entitled the King of Rome, he was declared Napoleon's heir in Italy as well as France.
Fast-track your career path with short-term training at UEI College in Southern California. You can get hands-on training in health.
Poor
It is interesting, just when you kind of look at how far Napoleon came. The dude came from, I believe his family was nobility, though not the highest of nobility, but like he still came so far from relative obscurity into marrying into like one of the most powerful families of all time, the Habsburgs. I always have problems saying their names. It's like, dude came far in life. Like, are you kidding me? This is so insane. It's something I admire about Napoleon, how he just brought himself to greater heights in life, you know? I think that's just something I always admire, because I think everyone, to some degree, wants to rise high, you know? I don't know, it's just like something I really like.
Old Eugene, his former stepson and the able viceroy who had been promised the throne, was displaced, though the emperor ensured he was generously compensated with a promise of the Grand Duchy of Frankfurt upon the incumbent ruler's death. Napoleon's dynasty was secure, but his empire seemed less so. A persistent problem for the French was one of finance. The ancien regime's poor credit, followed by the defaults of the revolutionary period, meant Napoleon had few options when it came to borrowing money. Most merchants and bankers of any influence had fled to London, and those that remained were extremely wary of loaning money to any government in Paris, not least one run by Napoleon. The result was that France basically couldn't run deficits if she still wanted to meet her financial obligations. Not a straightforward ask when over half of national revenue was gobbled up by the war each year. New taxes were introduced, including some of those most hated levies from the ancien regime, such as that on salt, but these nowhere near covered the cost of the enormous army Napoleon wished to maintain. The emperor's solution, as he told Marshal Soult, was to have war pay for war. Aside from heavy taxation, Napoleon's regime was funded in three ways. Firstly, the seizure of cash and property, the so-called ordinary contributions from various sources. Secondly, reparations from peace treaties, especially those with Prussia and Austria, which provided a steady inflow of francs, and finally, through stationing French troops in satellite states, or using conscripts from those states on campaign. Whichever way round, usually both, the ally, or more correctly, vassal, paid for the privilege. Two case studies probably offer the best example of how this worked in practice. The first of these is the Kingdom of Westphalia, created at Tilsit in 1807 and ruled by Napoleon's brother Jerome. A self-pitying spendthrift, he was the most incompetent of the Bonaparte siblings. His own want of talent would have made him a bad king anyway, but Napoleon hardly gave him much of a chance. Throughout the country's existence, Paris methodically ramped up demands on Jerome. First, it was extra war contributions in the form of cash or material. Then it was more effectively enforcing the continental system, Napoleon's attempted blockade of Britain that the country was flouting. After that came the ever-increasing number of French troops garrisoned in Westphalia, for no reason other than the fact Jerome had to pay for them. Napoleon even allocated himself a personal allowance of 7 million francs from the country's royal domains. Jerome himself was hardly forced into destitution, but the kingdom was slowly being bled dry by the emperor, and this arrangement was not unique. A similar system was seen in territories as diverse as Italy, Naples and Hanover. These fates, though, were perhaps preferable to that which befell Napoleon's other brother, Louis. Made King of Holland in 1806, unlike Jerome, he had actually tried to rule for the good of the Dutch, even attempting to learn the language. But Louis had been placed there to support French interests, as Napoleon made very clear in his frequent lecturing letters. "Forever at odds with my brother, who so often is unjust to me, but who was a father to me," Louis bemoaned. To support the war effort, Holland, as was standard, supplied men and ships for France, and was supposed to rigidly enforce the continental system. But Louis's failure to adequately deal with the Walcheren campaign in 1809 enraged Napoleon, who in a scathing rebuke all but declared him an agent of England. In truth, this was really the final straw for the emperor. Everything from Louis's abysmal treatment of his wife, Josephine's daughter Hortense, to his dogged refusal to implement French-style conscription in Holland had tried Napoleon's patience since 1806. However, it was Louis's failure to implement the blockade that really doomed him. The king did try to some extent and made efforts to clamp down on smuggling, but the Dutch, a commercial people whose towns were quickly plunged into poverty by the continental system, resisted fiercely. By 1809, 170 ships were involved in smuggling operations off the country's north coast. Upon his return from Austria, Napoleon had had enough. A new treaty was arranged in early 1810 that tightened his control over the country. Then, on the 1st of June, French troops marched across the border. In July, Holland was officially annexed. Louis fled to Bohemia. The Napoleonic system could not tolerate insubordination, even from a Bonaparte. As to whether Napoleon did succeed,
Napoleon runs his family like a freaking mafia boss. Dude acts like a mafia boss. Like, what he's doing is like I said, I've praised Napoleon a lot in terms of what I like about him, his genius, and some people have commented, you know, not disgust, but like obviously some people who watch my videos don't, not all of you like Napoleon, and there are many valid reasons not to like Napoleon or to just view him as a tyrant or as an evil person, and I get that for sure. Like I said, there's a lot I like about Napoleon. I admire his genius. I admire his talent. I admire his ability to raise himself, his ambition, you know, what he achieved in terms of glory. But there's a lot like I don't like about him. I never really liked his I guess now I'm getting into the point you'll hear me talk about things I don't like about Napoleon. I didn't like his nepotism in general, and Napoleon practiced it a lot. And yeah, his conduct between after the War of the Fourth Coalition to the Russian invasion was just like Napoleon making a lot of mistakes, doing a lot of making a lot of blunders, showing the worst of his character, especially at what he did to Spain and what he's doing here, right? Like, he's essentially like bleeding out his allies. And like I said, why would you want to be Napoleon's ally? Being Napoleon's ally is built on being afraid of Napoleon destroying you. And it's like, it's easy to see why people would flock to Britain. Britain at least like gave people money. You know, Napoleon takes people's money. And you know, like bleeding these places dry to make him, right? And then like the way he treated Russia and their alliance, which helped break it, and the way he treated Spain. Like, Napoleon doesn't treat other places. Everything is supposed to be completely under his control. He's the master, everyone else is the slave or servant. That's, you know, Napoleon's dominant personality, as I've called it. And that's just how he is. He wants things his way. He's in charge. There's no meeting Napoleon as an equal, you know, at least in his mind. And yeah, just he ruled very dominantly and with an iron fist, as you can even see in his own family. Yeah, and the system is like France, yeah, it's growing. It's huge, this empire Napoleon has, one of the greatest hegemonies empires of mainland Europe. But it's like this, now it's bringing a bunch of issues, right? Like, France is overextending itself now to the point where Napoleon kind of needs war. Like he said, we're going to use war to pay for war. You know, if it was just France, maybe just some territory, obviously would probably be better. I mean, I know when you win a war, you take territory. That's just a given. But like, they're expanding so much, and you're seeing the flaw of the system, and Napoleon's not helping it by basically destroying everyone's economies through the continental system, which is just the worst system ever. And you're just seeing so much, like they are overexerting. It's getting too big, and you know, and Napoleon, I don't think is a man satiated. I think he would have wanted even more if he could. But it's like, it's proving troublesome. With just France alone, Napoleon's fine. Like, when he first took power, like, he's fine. He can govern and like, govern well France. But now when he's bringing all this international stuff, like, he just chose to make the Confederation of the Rhine. He chose to take Spain. Like, now it's just, I think he's, in my opinion, biting off more than he can chew. And running an empire this huge obviously shows that it's bringing out like a lot of Napoleon's flaws and a lot of the faults of his systems, you know. And like I said, I think he may have overextended himself and his influence. Like, yeah, the bigger Napoleon got, it's almost like the more mistakes he made, you know? Like, I don't know. There's just a lot to it, I think.
In making war pay for war, the evidence is disputed. Perhaps the best article on the subject from Pierre Brander suggests he did not. By the end of his reign, he had outstanding bills of an estimated 500 million francs. Looking at individual case studies more closely, such as Mark Hay has done with the Dutch, Brander probably underestimated how effective Napoleon was at exploiting his allies. Still, it would be accurate to say that despite the Emperor's best efforts, his campaigns left outstanding payments of at least a few hundred million francs by the time of his first abdication. Lord Liverpool, British Prime Minister from 1812, recognised that this was the fatal flaw in the French Empire. Its dependency on looting Europe was ultimately why Napoleon would fail in the end. Whilst his armies were stationed in rich regions like Germany or northern Italy, resource extraction could go on for some time. But for those in impoverished countries such as Poland or Spain, the French very quickly sucked their surroundings dry of wealth, and delays in troop payments were common. Even in wealthy areas, this type of monetary extraction could not go on forever. All in all, France's allies and defeated enemies paid directly or indirectly a sum amounting to over 1.8 billion francs. These recent calculations have meant that historians like Brander have said it follows that the Napoleonic system effectively needed war to survive. Napoleon simply could not finance the large army he wanted, indeed had to maintain, without conquering more territory to pay for it. Part of the reason for Amiens' failure is explained by this conundrum. Peace, the return of so many soldiers to France that it would bring, and the eventual end of indemnities from defeated states could send the financial house of cards clattering down. As Brander says, only the defeat of Britain and the confiscation of its wealth could have restored French finances and made the Napoleonic system sustainable, at least for a time. London well knew this. It explains why even in the darkest days between 1807 and 1812, peace was rarely discussed. The choice for Whitehall was victory or enslavement.
Dang, that just puts a lot into perspective, right? Yeah, it's like it's not sustainable, right? Napoleon needs his army because his entire reign, all of his power, everything was won through his might. His throne was won through war, and so Napoleon needs the biggest, best army he could, but that's also proving to be like a very expensive thing. And it just goes to show, like, by getting so big and overexerting and all this, it's like almost put himself in an unsustainable situation. And yeah, this is wow.
As the British clung on, Napoleon continued the reorganisation of his empire. The first significant change had been made before Louis's dethronement in the middle of the Fifth Coalition. The Papal States had long been a thorn in his side. Initially, the Church had helped him restore some order to France. The Concordat, signed with the Pope in 1801, had gone a long way to securing his regime the support of French Catholics. By 1809, however, tensions with the Pope, Pius VII, were acute. Napoleon finally snapped and determined to annex what remained of the Papal States. The French had occupied Rome for over a year, and Pius protested with impeccable courtesy almost every action they took. The British offered to smuggle him out, but he refused, not wishing to politicise the papacy by joining the coalition of his own accord. Instead, a campaign of civil disobedience was organised. In response, Napoleon deported all cardinals in the states to Naples, but then struggled to find anyone to replace them with in government. Under wartime strain, a fed-up Napoleon announced the annexation of the Papal States on the 10th of June 1809. The following day, Pius excommunicated the Emperor of the French. Soon after, having had a garbled order from Napoleon to Murat passed down, which seemed to imply that Pius should be arrested, the Pope was effectively kidnapped by French troops. Napoleon had actually never intended this, admitting it was a major blunder upon hearing the news. What's done is done, he announced though. For the next 5 years, Pius, with admirable stoicism, was bundled from location to location under house arrest. The impact of this defeat was not immediately obvious in the way the loss of troops at Aspern was, but Pius's excommunication and kidnapping was another blow to Napoleon's prestige.
Yeah, that's insane. So that's the thing, like, Napoleon did good. Obviously, no, I don't think Napoleon's a religious man at all, but you know, he brought back religion, Catholicism to France, right? Because he believed it was a good way to keep the poor from eating the rich, and because it was something that was just pragmatic and good to do. But like, also you do see an ambivalence towards the faith, as this Napoleon's been beefing with the Pope and papacy since like Italy, the Italian campaign, you know, basically bullying the papacy. Napoleon obviously, like I said, his dominant personality, he just treats everyone lesser than him, other monarchs, everyone. Like, no one's Napoleon's equal, and there are a lot of aspects, you know, why you could see Napoleon get a big head like that. But it's also that lack of diplomacy, his lack of diplomacy and diplomatic skill, and his awful way of just treating foreign powers just goes to show why Napoleon made more enemies than he had friends. And yeah, like, but that's insane though. Like, you throwing your weight around with the Pope, obviously, it's like at this point, you know, I think the majority of people, I mean, this is a bit of an ignorant statement, I apologize, but you know, like, religion I think was more important then than you would see in modern days. Well, I know in America at least, like, nowadays more people are less religious in practice or even, you know, in name, but I imagine back then, obviously religion was more important to people, or at least to the wider majority. Then again, I don't know much about current mainland Europe, so it probably still could be to some degree, but obviously making an enemy out of the faith, and Napoleon has infamously been called the Antichrist. Yeah, he didn't endure himself. You can definitely see why, you know? And it's like it breaks your standing with what I would imagine most people practice faith at this point, Catholicism, and being excommunicated. I imagine, yeah, that would give you a completely like, yo, what? Like, religion is important to people, and now like your leaders basically they would see as a godless, right? A godless antichrist kind of man because of that excommunication. Just like completely bring down any sort of benevolent image Napoleon would have with common people.
Among Europe, and among his own subjects. In itself, this was of course not particularly dangerous for the Bonapartist regime, but for a man overtly aware of how insecure his grip on power was in many respects, it was yet another needless blunder. Elsewhere, Napoleon had grown tired of yet another brother, this time turning his wrath on Joseph, the beleaguered King of Spain. Joseph had always been given more autonomy than Louis or Jerome, and Napoleon was more receptive to his complaints, agreeing for example to suspend plans for withdrawing a French army from the peninsula at Joseph's behest. But the emperor never really understood the Spanish situation, not helped by the fact that the overwhelming predominance of French troops in the theatre meant he could, and did, bypass the actual government in Madrid on important decisions. This led to a clear disconnect between the facts on the ground and those in Napoleon's head. He dismissed Spanish resistance as second-rate, and viewed only the British as important. Yet his plans for defeating both of these threats often verged on the ridiculous. In 1810, Joseph's forces were advancing in the south, but Napoleon had by then grown to distrust his competence to govern. Catalonia was thus annexed and everything north of the Ebro placed under French military rule. Aragon was put in a state of siege under Marshal Suchet, and a similar situation was allowed to develop under Soult in Andalusia, meaning men whose only loyalty was to Napoleon had practically full control over the provinces. This left Joseph de facto governing only a tiny state surrounding Madrid, from which Napoleon demanded he find the money to cover the cost of the war. This he of course could not do, and subsidies sent south continued to burden the French treasury. Henceforth, the conflict was taken out of Joseph's hands. He was effectively left with just a small army of his own. Everything else was now directed from Paris. He wrote to his wife that he planned to abdicate, transferring some of his gold to England, where he perhaps hoped to join Napoleon's final brother Lucien in exile. He did not, but by 1810, even with the kingdom theoretically at its territorial height, the charade of Bonapartist Spain being anything other than a Napoleonic vassal was over. The long list of aforementioned problems with Napoleon's imperium by 1812 suggest an empire that was doomed to eventually collapse. Perhaps that was the case, yet in reality there was also no real question of it doing so in the medium term. Domestically, the heavy taxation, annual military harvest of young men, and hated system of conscription all bred resentment. But apart from pockets of opposition among royalists and Jacobins, the French people remained remarkably passive. Napoleon's stabilisation of France and his resounding military successes had given him a stable buffer of support, perhaps one larger than even he suspected. Areas that had been in revolt before he took power, such as Belgium and Luxembourg, were relatively quiet for the course of his reign. Outside of France's borders, many of the Germanic kings in the Confederation of the Rhine remained willing allies, despite the economic and military burdens Napoleon placed on them. French encouragement for these new kings to expand their control at the expense of the local nobility was happily accepted. If any objected to the obliteration of hundreds of sovereign states at the formation of the Confederation, then they wept as they took. Sporadic popular uprisings, seen briefly after Austria's call for them in 1809, were hardly a credible threat to French domination. Even in those places where Napoleon's rule was at its most draining, countries like Holland or the Hanseatic states, the populations offered no serious resistance. In time, the majority of these regions would rise up against the French, some at the behest of their rulers for pragmatic reasons, others out of a genuine desire for liberty. But the common trend in almost all cases was that they only did so once coalition armies were already driving the French out. Had it not been for the disasters of 1812, it is hard to imagine any part of Napoleon's empire, save the heroic Spanish and Portuguese, rising against him in the near future. The picture that emerges then is one of an empire not in imminent danger of collapse, but led by a ruler all too aware of the growing problems in the system, with few solutions for how to permanently solve them. Napoleon's empire was at its territorial height, but the cracks in the once invincible facade were there for all to see. The question was whether they would break before Britain did. The collapse of the Fifth Coalition was yet another bitter blow to the British war effort. They were not plunged back to the dire straits of 1807, but Napoleon had once again proved equal to the late Pitt's faith in continental coalitions. The only significant British action of the war, an attempt to seize Antwerp, had become a humiliating debacle, and in London the government appeared more unstable than ever. For now, Iberia remained the sole theatre that could threaten Napoleon, yet even here, those early hopes of victory had also vanished. Wellington's small but much celebrated victory at Talavera, for which he had been ennobled, was overshadowed by the relentless determination of Spanish generals to lose each new battle more spectacularly than the last. Defeats at Almonacid and Ocaña left Andalusia open to French occupation, whilst Wellington staged a fighting retreat back to Lisbon. In Parliament, the Whig opposition smelt blood in the water. Even whilst holed up in the newly built fortifications of Torres Vedras, the British army cost a fortune to maintain. Spain and Portugal were almost entirely dependent on subsidy from London. Even the navy, dominant though it currently was, had to be kept well funded and supplied so as to counter Napoleon's own maritime rearmament. Between 1809 and 1812, British finances were stretched to breaking point. Napoleon's attempts to strangle her trade with the continental blockade began to noticeably impact the economy. For sure, there were leaks everywhere, not least in France itself. Smuggling was commonplace, especially in conquered territories, but Napoleon's clampdown on such practices did have a notable impact. Trade between 1809 and 1810 especially was stagnant. By 1811 there were bread riots in British cities. Remarkably, these were not as bad as they could have been because of France. 74% of Britain's wheat imports in 1810 came from across the Channel. Small wonder that some historians have speculated that had Napoleon been prepared to basically impoverish his farmers for a year or two, Whitehall may have been forced to the negotiating table. The continental system and Britain's retaliatory blockade were odd balancing acts, as both sides tried to impoverish the other whilst reducing the pinch on themselves. But fundamentally, Napoleon's system had a range of flaws that could be exploited by the British. In the first place, it probably harmed France more than Britain. Those once prosperous port towns like Bordeaux became poverty-stricken. French custom revenues plummeted from 51 million francs in 1806 to 11.5 million in 1809. When essential products could not be manufactured domestically, Napoleon regularly agreed to special licenses that allowed them to be bought from Britain. The blockade also allowed Britain to consolidate its trade with the rest of the world. The US had prohibited British and French trade with the 1807 Embargo Act, but this was compensated for by the opening of Portuguese and eventually, under certain conditions, Spanish colonial markets. Indeed, because imports were now restricted from Europe, London's balance of trade was positive for the first time since 1780. As discussed earlier, this did not mean Britain was immune to the pinch at times, especially between 1810 and 11, when there was a downturn in trade and the price of the war spiralled. A printed and easily understood table of expenditure was only released from 1811 onwards, but the figures were not inspiring. Against expenses totalling £85 million, a number mainly made up from military costs and servicing the national debt, London had only a revenue of £69.2 million, leaving a deficit of nearly £16 million. Even this inadequate income was only made up through a direct tax burden, which had risen fivefold since 1792, alongside other indirect hikes. Fortunately for the government, Britain had the most advanced financial machinery in the world, whereas France's weak reputation as a debtor meant she effectively had to balance her budget. London's strong credit meant she could afford to be somewhat more unorthodox. The gold standard had been suspended in 1797, which consequently allowed for a degree of paper money printing and inflation within the system. The British were generally sensible with this, and money creation did not make a large contribution to the war economy, but it did give the government critical flexibility in short-term finance and debt management. Bankers and merchants in London were allowed to monitor government credit and ensure that the paper money kept its value. Many of them even sat in Parliament, able to question the government directly. Thus, despite the fact that francs were still backed by gold in Paris, the majority of bankers and merchants continued to prefer London as a place for their investments, consequently allowing it to float loans regularly without too many problems. The real crisis for the British was not so much the deficit as the shortage of specie. For practical purposes, this meant hard currency like Spanish dollars, with which continental allies were subsidised. An additional drain was the British army, which usually purchased rather than looted their supplies, and thus had to be paid in specie as well if they were to buy anything on campaign. By 1810, there was thus genuine fears London might lack the means to support the Peninsular War. Responsibility for managing this situation fell to the junior secretary at the Treasury, William Huskisson, for all intents and purposes a financial genius. He forbade any other department in Whitehall purchasing specie, as different agents would push up the price, and was thus able to secure about £9 million worth from Mexico in 1809. £2.5 million of this was destined for Wellington's army that year alone. London pulled through, but it was a sign of just how desperate the British war effort was at points. The defeat of Austria worsened not just financial problems, but also political ones. The aged Duke of Portland clung onto the premiership only because George III made him.
Okay, good. I just wanted to, absorb that for a second. Again, economics isn't my strong suit, my friends. That's why I needed to, shut up and really, understand that. But I will at least say, when Napoleon made it an economic war, yeah, at the end, Britain could sustain itself mainly through increasing trade with other parts of the world. I remember we covered that with Oversimplified, at least he said that. And yeah, just the economic warfare approach that Napoleon took just wasn't good. Because France, I've noticed, has a lot of problems with the economy, right? There's a lot to it, and it's I think what caught my attention the most was when he said Britain could afford to be more flexible or adaptable, I think, while France had to be more rigid. And you see France having to constantly borrow and bleed other people dry to sustain its economic situation. Napoleon's empire essentially needed to take to sustain itself in this whole theater shift into economic war. And the continental system isn't even helping it itself, so it's like I said, it really is Napoleon's first biggest and probably his biggest mistake, because it led to a lot of all his other mistakes. This obsession with beating Britain through economic means really played a hand in some of Napoleon's biggest mistakes. And like I said, this is the only video that goes so in-depth into the economic. Like I said, Old Britannia might just have the most thorough and informative Napoleonic videos in terms of the politics or what the heck's going on, nowhere else have I seen the intricacies of the economic affairs and how everyone's doing, and there's just so much to it, and I'm trying to absorb it, because like I said, economics isn't my thing, money and all that, but this is so just interesting to me, and you really just see the difference between Britain and France, and just why Britain could overcome an economic issue much better than France could.
But his infirmity left a dangerous power vacuum that Canning, the energetic Foreign Secretary, was determined to fill. Sensing Portland's end was near, most of Canning's time during the Fifth Coalition was spent trying to oust his rival Castlereagh rather than Napoleon. The Secretary for War's embarrassment over the Walcheren campaign, which he had championed, meant Portland agreed to his removal from the cabinet. To the Foreign Secretary's horror, the Prime Minister then dithered, and despite it being an open secret, nobody told Castlereagh of Canning's machinations. When someone inadvertently let it slip, a furious Castlereagh challenged Canning to a duel. These affairs usually ended with both opponents discharging their pistols in the air to restore honour, but this time they shot to kill. Castlereagh hit his opponent in the thigh, narrowly missing an artery. The incident was unsurprisingly a scandal. Both men resigned, as did Portland. It was yet another knock to Britain's war effort. Castlereagh in particular had, despite his embarrassment over Walcheren, been an excellent war secretary, faithfully supporting Wellington's campaign in the peninsula and shielding him from Whig criticism. Left with practically no
Politicians dueling each other is still the most unhinged thing ever. In America, one of the most famous duels is between Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, where Aaron Burr killed Alexander Hamilton. It's just Could you imagine modern day politicians? Could you imagine like freaking Trump, Donald Trump challenging someone to a duel? I'm sorry. Yeah, that's just insane. That's just something that always makes me laugh, you know? Like that's so insane that's like that was like a thing so common, you know? That would just happen like
Alternative, George III turned to a reluctant Spencer Perceval. Perceval is a much underrated Prime Minister, whose current status as a pub trivia is hardly commensurate with his achievements. For 3 years he helmed the British government during some of the war's harshest moments, at the cost of deep personal unpopularity that was to lose him his life. Throughout it all he was sustained by his wife, his deep Christian faith, and genuine love of country. Forming a government to start with was no easy task. The removal of Castlereagh Canning was a blow only offset by the abundance of talent now rising through the rest of the Tory party ranks. The great beauty of the unreformed constitution was that a promising young man could be slotted into a pocket borough at any time. In this way, future Prime Ministers Palmerston and Peel received their first jobs in government around this time. It's not too absurd an exaggeration to say that the might of Napoleon's empire was effectively brought down by a small gaggle of schoolboys working themselves ragged. The war effort in the peninsula could only continue because the new Secretary for War, former Lord Hawkesbury, now Lord Liverpool, and his underling Palmerston rose to the challenge. Palmerston in particular, still only in his mid-20s, astonished Parliament with his mastery of financial details relating to the army. The once lumbering machinery of Whitehall, dependent on patronage and corruption, was reformed in these years into a devastatingly efficient instrument of government. Even so, Perceval's weak government was not expected to survive the 1810 session, a prediction compounded when George III relapsed once again into insanity, a condition that had become permanent by the following year. This was a genuine tragedy. George was not only a good man, he was also thrifty, hard-working, and an able judge of talent. He was losing his sight, and with it the will to partake in government as much as he once had in these years, but was also at the height of his personal popularity among the public. The loss of the finest British monarch since the Great Queen 2 centuries earlier could be further added to the country's run of bad luck. A diagnosis seen as all the more apparent at the time, for the man replacing him was the polar opposite. In 1811, George, soon to be made Prince Regent by Parliament, was a mendacious, self-pitying degenerate, whose only achievement in life so far had been to amass a rather fine art collection. As a youth, he had rebelled against his father's sensible Toryism and aligned himself with the debauched, loose Charles James Fox. Fox had been the most prominent Whig politician before his death in 1806, and George was expected to invite what loosely constituted that party to form a government after the limits on his regency powers expired. But, having been afflicted with a very rare attack of common sense, the Prince Regent dithered. He half-heartedly tried to convince the Whigs to join Perceval's government in some form.
I love his little jabs he throws in. Oh, that's funny. I noticed the last video, I didn't directly call it out, but I do love when he does a little jab towards anyone. And yeah, King George, infamous for his madness. There's even a movie about it, The Madness of King George. Yeah, very interesting guy overall in the world, not only in the Napoleonic era, but like in American history too, right? And with the revolution and everything, just a very interesting guy in a very interesting time.
When they refused, he continued to support the Tories. Of all moments in the Napoleonic Wars, this was undoubtedly the most dangerous for Britain. The Whigs were a mix of total incompetence like Grey, short-termist treasury-brained whingers like Grenville, or basically traitors like Fox had been. Canning's glorious jibe at their foreign policy was as true in 1811 as it had been a decade earlier. Counterfactuals are never certain, but had George done as expected and forced Perceval out in favour of the Whigs, they would almost certainly have made peace soon after, balking at the cost of the Peninsular War, left Napoleon supreme in Europe and led Britain into enslavement a few years later. That this did not happen was, whatever his faults, down solely to the Prince Regent. For all of this, the British clung on. Military setbacks, economic overstretch and political instability could not shake the government or the population's belief in the war. All of the Tory ministers had witnessed the failure of Amiens. All of them knew what defeat meant. Among the British public there was no doubt unrest. But there was remarkably little aimed at the war effort itself. The Luddites in the north were concerned with technological advancements taking their skilled jobs. Bread riots rarely called for an end to the conflict. For the most part, the British public were prepared to bear the strain of war in pursuit of survival. And by 1812 it seemed the worst of the crisis may well have been over. In Spain, Massena's army had spent 6 months sat outside Lisbon, wasting away from disease and starvation. His eventual retreat in 1811 offered some rare good news, to the extent even Grey accepted he had been wrong in his opposition, though this by no means ended with criticism of the Peninsular War's cost, especially as the rest of 1811 was still essentially one of frustration. Portugal was liberated, but not much else. Nonetheless, Wellington's army had shown its purpose. Re-equipped and supplied in 1812 as Napoleon stripped troops from the theatre for his coming invasion of Russia, he was prepared to take the fight back into Spain itself. Poor old Spencer Perceval, however, would not live to see it. By 1812 his government, expected only to survive a few months 3 years earlier, was the strongest since Pitt's first ministry. Castlereagh, sufficiently rehabilitated, was brought back into cabinet as Foreign Secretary, and Addington, ennobled as Lord Sidmouth since his premiership a decade earlier, returned in the role of Lord President of the Council. But on the 11th of May, a deranged merchant, annoyed at having been denied compensation for imprisonment in Russia, assassinated the Prime Minister in the Palace of Westminster. His widow and 13 children were amply provided for by Parliament, but it was a sad end to the—
Did you just say 13? Oh my goodness. That's so many kids. But holy crap. I really like this because, like, there's... Usually with most Napoleonic videos, they never cover exactly what's going down in Britain. Obviously, they'll say Britain funded coalitions and Britain, hated Napoleon. But it's nice seeing that things were... there was a lot of chaos, everywhere. But at the end, they were willing to all fight Napoleon to the bitter end. That goal never wavered. And that kind of, in a weird way, like, united them even more to endure so much hardship, right? All to see Napoleon's downfall. So yeah, just the British spirit is insane. Like, you also see it in, like, World War II, where the Nazis were, like, bombing them and they just kept going. Like, yeah, the British spirit is just another thing,
The career of a much overlooked premier. For the country, it seemed to herald another period of political uncertainty as the Prince Regent struggled to find a replacement. The man he eventually turned to was not a natural fit for the highest office in the kingdom, yet over the next 15 years the Earl of Liverpool was to lay the foundations for a century of British dominance. First, however, there was a war to win. Weakest of the great powers at the start of the Napoleonic Wars, Prussia had been fortunate to survive as one at all. Shattering defeats at Jena-Auerstadt and subsequent military collapse left her dependent on the good graces of Alexander I to avoid complete obliteration by Napoleon. Still, the terms signed at Tilsit in 1807 were brutally harsh. About half the country was amputated, the army, or what was left of it, restricted to 43,000 men, and around 500 million francs was eventually extracted by the French as an indemnity or otherwise. In the aftermath, the depressed Frederick William remained in the eastern city of Königsberg, whiling away his days in a stupor, talking of abdication. No one could have blamed him for accepting his lot. His great-uncle's kingdom seemed to have been all but swept away. In this darkest of moments, it was his wife, Queen Louise, that took on the burden of starting the long rebuilding process. Yet in defeat, there was also opportunity. Reformers before 1806 had been easily dismissed or ignored. Frederick William himself later admitted that whilst he knew his army had weaknesses, he could not expect veterans of the Silesian Wars to listen to his opinions. Now they had no choice. "Where is Baron von Stein?" Louise asked immediately following Tilsit. "He's my last hope." The Queen, though pregnant and never again in full health following her hazardous escape east in 1806, knew she had to re-energise her husband. At her prodding, he recalled to office the men that would transform Prussia. Stein, Hardenberg, Scharnhorst were names that had previously been despised by the old guard in Berlin. The king himself had sacked Stein only months earlier for insubordination. Now they were given free rein to remould the Prussian state. Hardenberg and Stein first compelled Frederick William to dissolve the old chaotic system.
I will say Prussia definitely gets his revenge. Like, Napoleon was so brutal with them. It is a miracle he didn't just completely destroy it, dismantle Prussia. But he definitely left them at a point where they were basically on life support. And his conduct towards the royalty obviously shows that, yeah, he had a lot of hate for Prussia. And but I will say, like, King Frederick was kind of, we've seen him in a lot of past videos, kind of a pushover, a little bit more of a passive guy, not someone people respect. His wife, Queen Louise, definitely was a much stronger character, I feel. And you see, like, her really get it up, like, pick him up from, and even from that stupor he's in. And yeah, Prussia does go on to be quite the menace in the future. That in this defeat they definitely got back up, and obviously everyone's gonna modernize, adapt to Napoleon little by little. And it's kind of funny that Prussia, like at Waterloo, plays a part in Napoleon's final defeat. So yeah.
System of government, which relied on ministers competing with personal advisors for the monarch's attention. In its place was to be a central executive consisting of 5 clearly designated ministries, each supplying a minister with direct access to the king. This would streamline government and prevent the crippling inaction that overlapping responsibilities between advisors had previously caused. It would, so the reformers argued, allow the king to make swift and informed decisions. Theoretically, a monarch confident in his abilities and able to make up his mind should have thrived under such a system, but Prussia did not have such a monarch. Instead, they had Frederick William, a man that...
Yeah, so I love his little jabs, but it's completely true. Frederick William, like I said, he never struck me as a man of strong character. A very pushed over monarch, pushed over by Napoleon, Alexander, just like not a well respected man. I kind of feel bad for him. He seems like a nice guy, but yeah, I don't know. I don't. There are issues with him that I'll leave it at that.
That was hardly overburdened with self-confidence. Ideally, though, the new governmental structure would offer, especially in international affairs, a clearer policy. The other great reform immediately focused upon after Tilsit was that of the Prussian army. For so long the country's pride, its near-total collapse in 1806 had been an unbearable humiliation. What was perhaps worse than the lost battles were the capitulations elsewhere. Most of Prussia's forts had been well garrisoned and supplied, yet most surrendered almost without a fight, crushing any chance of the army recovering. It was a disgrace Frederick William, usually slow to decide, responded to with unusual fury, ordering any officer that surrendered in such circumstances again be shot. The inadequacy of the Prussian army was not a surprise to many of the reformers. As far back as 1802, a military society had been formed where officers read papers to each other recommending change. The most dominant figure here was Scharnhorst, a peasant-born Hanoverian that had risen swiftly through the Prussian ranks after joining in 1801. Even before Jena, he had been calling for a French-inspired divisional system and establishing a territorial militia as a reserve force. These ideas had not been well received by the 7 Years' War fossils that still dominated the Prussian military before 1806, and little had been done. Now, in the aftermath of Tilsit,
they had to learn the hard way, essentially, right? It's like, the old heads, I guess you can't teach an old dog new tricks, is what they say. The old heads were like, well, we fought in the 7 Years' War, for Frederick the Great, like, who are you to, who are these new guys to say anything? But it's like, it goes to show the moment they met, Prussia got humiliated bad, guys. Like, freaking, I love Davout. He's my favorite marshal. I consider him the best marshal. One marshal being able to solo the main Prussian army goes to show you how bad they were. Like, how behind they were. And yeah, it just goes to show you they had to learn the hard way. The thing isn't, the old ways aren't working. You gotta change now. Napoleon has changed the way war is fought. You have to fight differently. You have to adapt. You have to evolve. And yeah, just have to evolve.
Tilsit, the king swept aside remaining opposition and appointed a military reorganisation committee to undertake reforms. Scharnhorst was the key voice, supported by a quartet of Gneisenau, Boyen, Grollmann, and a very young man named Karl von Clausewitz. These five spearheaded a range of reforms. A Ministry of War was created, within which the rudiments of a general staff organisation began to coalesce. Scharnhorst drove through improvements in training, tactics and weaponry. The leadership was purged, 208 officers removed, 17 generals were simply sacked, another 86 given honourable discharges. All in all, just over a quarter of Prussian officers survived. From now on, recruitment was to be meritocratic and open to talent, an approach that, combined with the implementation of universal military service and abolition of the worst forms of corporal punishment, was to build a truly national army. The Prussian forces that faced Napoleon in 1813 were to be a very different beast. Next came the need to revitalise what remained of the country's economy. Dominated by the guild system and serfdom, Frederick William had again seen the disadvantages of such practices well before 1806, but again lacked the confidence to bring about any reform. In 1807 this was changed with the October Edict, really only a declaration of intention rather than a decree of substance. It provided for meritocracy in employment and equality under the law. In practice, this meant something approaching a free land market was created. Guilds were effectively abolished, occupations opened to talent. In commerce, the labour market, internal trade and tax, Prussia's reforms were undoubtedly the most radical among those German states, also undertaking similar experiments. No one would deny this revolution was successful. The Prussian army of 1813 shocked Napoleon with its newly acquired efficiency. Economically, Prussia was just about able to avoid bankruptcy under the crushing weight of reparations. Yet recent historiography has tended to see them as less transformative than originally thought. The reformers themselves squabbled relentlessly. Opposition from the nobility, especially in Junker-dominated East Prussia, remained strong, and the movement lost a good deal of impetus when Napoleon, respectful as ever of national sovereignty, ordered Stein's dismissal in 1808. Even the army would lose its initial engagements in 1813 to a flock of French children. Still, they gave a momentum to the government that carried them into the post-war world. Perhaps most importantly, they inspired a degree of confidence that at some point in the future, Prussia may be able to challenge the French behemoth. As it was, no reform in the world could have alleviated Prussia's position 2 years on from Tilsit. She had remained warily non-committal in the Fifth Coalition, even with much of the military clearly favouring intervention on Austria's side, to the extent that Frederick William thought they might force him to abdicate. With his control over Europe secure once more in late 1809, Napoleon ordered the king, who until that point had remained in Königsberg, to return to Berlin where the French could watch him more closely. The next year, further disaster struck when Queen Louise, a figurehead for the country, died aged only 34. The king has lost his best minister, was Napoleon's tribute. Even so, her death did not see any loss of confidence among the reformers. There were proposals from the likes of Gneisenau for a Spanish-style insurrection amongst the whole German people. Regardless of whether or not this was even possible, Frederick William and most of the military were uncomfortable with such a radical and uncontrollable form of warfare. Instead, the king only agreed in mid-1811 to enlarge the army. This rearmament was impossible to hide, and Napoleon responded with an ultimatum, warning that if such activity did not cease immediately, the French ambassador would be replaced with Marshal Davout at the head of an army. Gneisenau strongly objected to complying with this outright.
Oh my goodness. I love that. I love he specifically named Davout, the guy who like handed Prussia its biggest L. He's like, hey, remember Davout? I'm gonna unleash him on you again if you don't chill out. I love that. Oh man. Yeah, Davout, the ultimate Prussian slayer. You should have just put Davout there. Just be like, Davout, you're in charge of Prussia now. Watch them, keep them, you know. Well, he was at Hardenberg, I believe, besieged during the Sixth Coalition, but yeah, overall, it seems like Prussia is just a nuisance. It's almost interesting why Napoleon didn't just straight up dismantle it. Like, I'm wondering what maybe he could have gotten away with it too. I don't know. I think we talked about it in like the War Aims video of Old Britannia, but yeah, with how much Napoleon just hated and just basically stepped on Prussia, I think more than any other country, he's just like, the amount of disrespect he gives Prussia is on another level. Like, I'm surprised he didn't just dismantle it completely, absorb it into like other places like the Duchy of Warsaw, Russia, you know, the Confederation of the Rhine. Like, that's interesting. I don't know. I'm almost wondering. I'm surprised he didn't. That's mainly it, you know.
Bullying, but Frederick William, probably correctly given the circumstances, overruled him and suspended rearmament.
Dude, of course Frederick William, dude, he was like, I saw Davout in action, we don't want that smoke, we don't want to fight Marshal Davout again. Frederick William was there, he got his butt kicked hard, he probably had like a flashback of Davout. I'm sorry, I love Davout so much, but that's just a funny thread Napoleon made right there.
Finally destroyed practically any remaining faith in Napoleon was the offensive treaty he forced Berlin to sign in February 1812. With the massive Grand Army he had raised marching east, Prussia had to agree to supply and open all fortresses to it, along with providing a 12,000-man auxiliary corps. This agreement was extorted by offering the Prussians the choice of the Grand Army entering as a friend or foe. Even by Bonaparte's standards, this was just common banditry, but Prussia was hardly in a position to resist. Scharnhorst retired from public life, Gneisenau and Clausewitz went to join Stein in service to the Tsar. Unsurprisingly, supplying this juggernaut was hardly within the abilities of impoverished East Prussia. Individual commanders simply ordered their troops to carry out independent requisitioning. It was said that those who still owned draft animals sowed at night so as to not have their last ox carted off. Discipline among the French soon broke down and they resorted to extortion and plunder. One official thought the devastation was worse than the 30 Years' War. A soldier reported that the average Prussian peasant simply couldn't understand why they were so badly treated by an ally of their king. A Hanoverian diplomat wrote that the French had left the inhabitants of Prussia with nothing but eyes to weep with in their misery. Among the peasantry, the mood shifted from resentment to simmering hatred. But in the end, what could they do against an emperor who at this point appeared to think he was restricted by nothing? The Tilsit system.
Yeah, I just find Napoleon's awful conduct. He doesn't even he treats everyone like lesser, but like Prussia specifically, he treats like absolute dog crap. like man, Napoleon is just like throwing his weight around. He's like just casually threatening them, and yeah, it's just insane. His utter disdain towards Prussia.
System, established by Napoleon and Alexander's meeting in 1807, was very clearly dead by the end of the Fifth Coalition. Officially, it continued into 1810, arguably even until Napoleon crossed the Niemen, but both emperors now looked at one another as potential enemies again. Napoleon's brief attempts to revive the link with a Russian marriage only served to confirm this to everyone. The question, however, is whether a breakdown in the alliance inevitably led to a war between the two. The varied nature of the grievances both monarchs had by 1812 mean the answer seems to be yes. The most obvious problem for Alexander can be shown by simply glancing at a map. The Grand Duchy of Warsaw had been created at Tilsit from former Polish territories. Since then, Napoleon had allowed it to expand rapidly via the annexation of Galicia in 1809. To St. Petersburg, this looked as if the French were laying the groundwork for a fully restored Polish nation, one that would have claims to large chunks of what was now Russian land. Ironically, Alexander was, in his own unorthodox way, really quite sympathetic to the Poles, but the excessive militarization of the duchy, combined with Napoleon's refusal to set a hard limit on Warsaw's future expansion, presented a clear strategic threat to the Russian Empire that could not be ignored. Then there was the extra troops placed in Prussia, which violated the terms of Tilsit. The greatest and most irreconcilable of problems for Russia, however, was the continental system, agreed to by Alexander in 1807.
Just like, you see so much problems with how the way Napoleon handled foreign powers. In Russia, definitely so many reasons for Russia to just like, yeah, we don't want to be your allies anymore. Obviously, a restored Poland is a threat, so obviously that's already a beyond sore spot, like a straight up insult, right? To have the Duchy of Warsaw right there. Violating the Treaty of Tilsit, another one, like you're just breaking our treaty. And the continental system, which affected everyone's economy, so it's just like, yeah, like, why would anyone want to be Napoleon's ally? Like, he doesn't help anyone except himself. Like, you know, like, he brings a lot of issues on everyone. Like I said, I always kind of thought it was more Napoleon's fault that the alliance with Russia fell apart. It seems like Russia, at least Tsar Alexander, was trying, but Napoleon obviously, I think, never saw him as a true equal. I think Napoleon never saw anyone as a true equal, even among monarchs. And obviously, I feel like, yeah, did Russia do some things? Definitely, but like, I feel like it falls more on Napoleon. At least from what I see, you know?
By 1810, the effects were taking their toll. The collapsing value of the paper ruble was a particular challenge of the blockade. At the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars, it had been valued at 3/4 of its silver equivalent. By 1811, it was worth less than 1/4. The consequent collapse of its foreign exchange value meant financing armies abroad ballooned in cost. In 1809, state income was less than half of expenditure. The government took a host of dramatic actions to deal with this, from cutting expenses to halting the money printing, but the key change was the banning of luxury goods importation and the encouragement of neutral shipping to carry Russian exports. The luxury ban in particular Napoleon announced, wrongly, was specifically aimed at him, and with more truth, that neutral ships were being used as a cover for trade with Britain. Alexander responded that it was his right to set tariff policy, so long as it did not violate treaty obligations. What rankled the Russians even more was that, rather than the punitive attack on British trade agreed to at Tilsit, the continental system had, as Dominic Lieven puts it, very obviously morphed into a policy where France bled the rest of Europe white in order to boost its own trade and revenues. The number of special licenses Napoleon issued for trade with Britain hardly escaped St. Petersburg's notice.
Yeah, even Napoleon's allowing special licenses, like, what the heck? Like, it was even hurting France itself. It was just a bad system that just kind of basically extorted everything from everyone else. Like, it's really Napoleon's worst system. Like, Napoleon at his worst is with the continental system. Like, yeah, like, you're just seeing this from Russia's perspective. You can see so many faults, right? Like Alexander, like, I don't begrudge, like, obviously it makes perfect sense why they would want to just stop dealing with Napoleon, you know?
To the extent even Caulaincourt complained the Russians could not be expected to hold to the system in the face of the Emperor's actions. Even Rumyantsev, a Russian patriot but tentative supporter of the French alliance, admitted by 1812 Napoleon's blatant dishonesty made cooperation impossible. In 1811, France annexed a series of coastal territories to clamp down on smuggling. In doing so, Napoleon once more violated Tilsit by seizing the Duchy of Oldenburg, the ruler of which Alexander was related to. This was a final humiliation that made the break between the two emperors.
And then there's the invasion of Swedish Pomerania, that made Bernadotte turn on Napoleon. Like, oh my goodness, I'm telling you guys, Napoleon is bad at diplomacy. When it comes to foreign affairs, Napoleon is just not great at it. He can't work with other people. It's just, he tries to exert his will and what he wants. Essentially, he's the number one guy. Everyone else is below him. And yeah, it's not a great diplomatic approach, you know, to have. Like I said, it's just like, why would you want to be Napoleon's ally? You don't gain much from it. He treats his allies awfully. And yeah, the biggest problem with Napoleon is that he had more enemies than friends. And the few friends he did have became enemies. And you can see why Napoleon doesn't have many friends. That's just the thing, man. Like, you know, like, yeah, there's just a lot not to like about Napoleon, especially at this period of his, like, career.
It's clear. That same year, Napoleon began preparing his massive invasion of Russia. For the French Emperor's part, the Russian campaign offered an opportunity to crush what had become an annoying rival. What Napoleon officially wanted from the campaign was never seriously defined. The main issue was of course the continental system. If he could get St. Petersburg to re-engage with it, there was a chance of bringing Britain to her knees. But how he intended to do this was never particularly clear. Did he plan to annex the Baltic coast, or trust Alexander to hold to any treaty? As always with Napoleon, military victory would have to come first, creating a sustainable system later. And so, he began assembling the largest army seen on the continent since the days of Rome. The next campaign was to define the future of Europe.
And that's it. At the time of this recording, there is no more Old Britannia Napoleonic videos, so we for the most part have covered the majority of it. Like I said, I love his videos. They are the most informative, most thorough Napoleonic videos in terms of the politics of the era. And yeah, it's just so much to it. Like, overall, splendidly done. I feel like I've learned so much about this freaking era, dude. Like, all these Napoleon videos, like, there's just so much to this one era, and I really love it. And, yeah, there's just, like I said, there's just so much going on. I just love the way he jumps, and you see everyone's perspective. I don't know. That's what I really like. I think I like how much shine he gives everyone aside from Napoleon, you know, so you definitely come to sympathize and see where everyone else is coming from under Napoleon. And like I said, I think, you know, I've praised Napoleon a lot, but I feel like these videos I definitely talk more about what I don't like about Napoleon, which I think has given me a definitely more nuanced view of him. You know, like I said, I really love a lot of aspects to Napoleon, but there's a lot of aspects I don't like about him, and I think those aspects come into full view during after the Treaty of Tilsit all the way through the Russian invasion. Like, that's like Napoleon probably where I least like him, those years, you know. Um, so yeah, it's just like, I really love this video. It's super late right now. I need to stop. I watched the last video and this one back to back, but overall, I really love this video. I love this being informed, and I'm looking forward to more in the future, because he has to make at least another one, right? And I'm gonna look up some of these sources. I'm gonna have to do my own reading. And yeah, I'll see you all in the next one. Bye everyone.